any state that has the ability to inflict full spectrum dominance on its citizens is not a free state. The crimes for which Richard Nixon, along with the abuses of power by the FBI that prompted the very formation of the Church Commission, are now legal. Our liberty has been sacrificed on the altar of national security. To obtain your personal information, the FBI can now freely issue national security letters to your bank, your doctor, your employer, your public library, or any of your associates without a judicial warrant, and you will never be notified of an investigation. It can collect and store in perpetuity all your metadata of your email correspondence and phone records and track your geographical movements everywhere. It can assassinate U.S. citizens if it brands this citizen to be a terrorist. It can order the military under Section 1021, as I mentioned, to arrest you, strip you of due process, and hold you indefinitely in military detention facilities, including in our offshore penal colonies. The state now hunts down and throws into prison any who attempt to expose the illegality of what it is doing, as with Chelsea Manning, or as with the forced exile of Edward Snowden. And this is always how totalitarian secret police forces work, from the SS to the KGB to the East German Stasi. Dissent is criminalized, truth is hidden. And of course, like these older security services, ours engages in torture. The fall of the Soviet Union left America without a competing superpower. This threatened to delegitimize the state's massive spending on war and state security, now more than 50% of our budget. But a tiny group of Islamic radicals who never posed an existential threat to our country emerged to take the place of the old communist bloc. The politics of fear, the psychosis of permanent war, were continued with only minor adjustments to the language and iconography. The illegal and disastrous occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan, along with our indiscriminate bombing through drones of countries such as Pakistan and Somalia, coupled with the war crimes that Israel is carrying out with our assistance against the Palestinian people, are driving many in the Muslim world into the arms of these militant groups. The United States has become perhaps the most hated nation on earth. At the same time, globalization, the corporate policy of creating a worldwide neo-feudalism of masters and serfs, means there is a growing need on the part of the oligarchic elite to spy on the masses at home and abroad, to prevent unrest and revolt. After all, if you are a worker, things are only going to get worse. These intelligence services exist not only to protect the corporate state, but to spy on corporate competitors of American companies, including the Brazilian oil giant Petrobras, as well as competing corporations in Germany and France. This system of mass surveillance voraciously steals information from the leaders of countries, including our allies, such as German Chancellor Angela Merkel, whose personal cell phone the NSA tapped. The NSA spied on UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. It spied on Pope Francis and the conclave of Catholic cardinals that elected him last year. It carried out a major eavesdropping effort focused on the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Bali in 2007, and NSA officials, meanwhile, bugged their ex-lovers, their wives, and their girlfriends. And all this data is stored in perpetuity in government computers. The legal system like our legislative system, has collapsed. It has made lawful everything from indefinite detention to torture to wholesale surveillance. Where are our judges? Where are our deans of our law schools? Where are our law professors? Where are the some 1 million lawyers? Why do they refuse to defend the Constitution? They have rather become valued partners, along with a bankrupt press, in the campaign to eradicate our most basic civil liberties. And let us not forget that the assault on our civil liberties has been far more egregious under Barack Obama than under George W. Bush. The security state and our for-profit military-industrial complex masterfully manipulated the trauma of September 11th. These forces used the attacks as an excuse to increase the massive pilfering of taxpayer dollars, especially by the Department of Homeland Security, which has a public budget of $98.8 billion. The truth, however, is that the system of internal security is so vast and so secret, no one in the public has any idea how large our programs are or how much we spend. The irony is that our 16 intelligence agencies overlooked the numerous signs and evidence leading up to the 9/11 attacks. They failed, just as they did when they were unable to anticipate the fall of the Shah of Iran or the collapse of the Soviet Union, or when they told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. But there is a rule in Washington: never reform failed bureaucracies. Never hold government officials accountable. Rather, give them more money, and above all, keep failure a secret. Relationships with foreign intelligence services have, at the same time, vastly expanded our system of global mass surveillance, creating an immense global system that obliterates the rights of people at home and abroad. Now, I'm aware that the President has recently promised new reforms. But I ask you, how many times does Barack Obama have to lie to you before you get it? Look at his review group on intelligence and communications technologies, set up ostensibly to make recommendations for reform. The very same intelligence chiefs that have carried out these abuses led and directed the group. Or look at the request by the German Chancellor that we stop spying on her and her citizens. The US government rebuffed her request. It sent a message to her that we should all heed. And this message is, it will continue to do whatever it wants. The corporate state has no intention of giving up the most effective and pervasive system of mass surveillance in human history. And all vaunted reform will be empty and cosmetic. The NSA and other intelligence agencies have become our nation's voyeurs and peeping toms. They read our electronic bank and medical records. They know what our kids post on Facebook or Instagram. They have all of our emails and text messages. They track our movements through the GPS on our cell phones, and they are not alone. Corporations also track our online searches, what we buy, and then analyze and store that data to use it for commercial purposes. We cannot trust those who hold this power and profit from it to reform themselves. History has too many examples of such naive trust being breached. Only an independent judiciary can constrain those in power, and that is why Congress and our courts have been emasculated. That is why our judiciary has rewritten laws, from the NDAA to the FISA Amendment Act, to strip us of legal protection. The very courts and legal system designed to protect us have been turned against us. The irony is that Barack Obama would not even be president if it were not for the courage of persecuted dissidents such as Martin Luther King or Malcolm X, spied upon by their own government. But Obama understands where power lies. It does not lie with a citizen. It lies with Wall Street and our corporate boardrooms, which have carried out a slow-motion coup d'etat. And the system of mass surveillance is designed to keep these elites in these boardrooms powerful and the rest of us powerless. As a presidential candidate in 2008, Obama promised to, quote, reject the use of national security letters to spy on citizens who are not suspected of a crime. He promised to close our detention center in Guantanamo Bay. He said he would revisit the Patriot Act. He assured us he would overturn unconstitutional executive decisions issued by the Bush administration. He promised to shut down our black sites. He promised to end extraordinary rendition. He promised transparency and reform. We got none of this. What we got were more untruths, such as last summer, when the President told us that the NSA cannot target your emails. That's a quote. And that all our surveillance systems were subject to the full control of Congress. In fact, Obama, along with our Congress and our highest courts, have together eradicated the Fourth Amendment, which once protected us from government intrusion into our persons, homes, papers, and effects. Everything he and other government officials promised to do or told us about domestic internal surveillance has turned out, we now know, to be a lie. If you think you are innocent or that you have nothing to hide, you do not understand what is happening. Justice, like truth in these systems, is not relevant. Ask Chelsea Manning, Julian Assange, or Edward Snowden, along with whistleblowers like Thomas Drake, where justice and truth got them. And one of the main tasks of any security service is blackmail, a tactic the FBI used to get Martin Luther King to try and commit suicide. If you have any dirt, the state wants to know about it, and they will use it against you if you refuse to be obedient. My country, right or wrong, is the immoral equivalent of my mother, drunk or sober, G.K. Chesterton reminded us. So let me end today by speaking to you about those drunk with the power to sweep up all your email correspondence, your tweets, your web searches, your phone records, your file transfers, your live chats, your financial data, your medical data, your criminal and civil court records, and your movements. Those who are awash in billions upon billions of taxpayer dollars, those who have banks of sophisticated computer systems, along with biosensors, scanners, face recognition technologies, and miniature drones, those who have obliterated your anonymity, your privacy, and yes, your liberty. There is no free press without the ability of reporters to protect the confidentiality of those who have the moral courage to make public the abuse of power. Those few individuals inside government who have dared to speak out against the system of mass surveillance have been charged as spies under the Espionage Act or hounded into exile. An omnipresent surveillance state, and I covered the East German Stasi state as a reporter, creates a climate of paranoia and fear. It makes democratic dissent impossible. Any state that has the ability to inflict full spectrum dominance on its citizens is not a free state. The relationship between those who are constantly watched and tracked and those who watch and track them is the relationship between masters and slaves. And those who wield this unchecked power become delusional. General Keith Alexander, the director of the National Security Agency, hired a Hollywood set designer to turn his command center at Fort Meade into a replica of the bridge of the Starship Enterprise so he could sit in the captain's chair and pretend he was Jean-Luc Picard. James Clapper, the Director of National Intelligence, had the audacity to lie under oath to Congress. This spectacle was a rare glimpse into the absurdist theater that now characterizes American political life. I was, as I mentioned, a plaintiff before the Supreme Court in Clapper versus Amnesty International, which challenged the FISA Amendment Acts of 2008. These acts authorized surveillance without a showing or probable cause that a targeted person is an agent of a foreign power. The court, as I mentioned earlier, dismissed our lawsuit because it said that the idea we were targets of surveillance was based on speculation. This Supreme Court ruling was then used, as I mentioned, to support the Obama administration's appeal of our successful challenge to Section 1021 of the National Defense Authorization Act. Now, the government, in both of these cases, never attempted to defend the surveillance and detention programs as constitutional. What they did rather was to say that I and the other plaintiffs had no right to bring the case to court, and these courts agreed. The Fourth Amendment, which limits the state's ability to search and seize to a specific place, time, and event approved by a magistrate, is impossible to square against the arbitrary search and seizure of all our personal communications. And even former Vice President Al Gore has said correctly that Snowden disclosed evidence of crimes against the United States Constitution. We who have been fighting against mass surveillance for years have made no headway by appealing to the traditional centers of power. It was only after Snowden stole and leaked documents that disclosed crimes committed by the state that any genuine public debate began. Elected officials, for the first time, suddenly promised reform. The President, who had previously dismissed our questions about the extent of state surveillance by insisting there was strict congressional and judicial oversight, appointed a panel to review intelligence. He has now promised to end bulk storage of our data, although like past promises, this one, if you read the fine print, is largely symbolic. 3 judges have, since the Snowden revelations, ruled on mass surveillance, with 2 saying the NSA spying was unconstitutional and the 3rd supporting it. None of this would have happened, none of it, without Snowden. Now, Snowden had access to the full roster of everyone working at the NSA. He could have made public the entire intelligence community and undercover assets worldwide. He could have exposed the locations of every clandestine station and their missions. He could have shut down the surveillance system, as he said, in an afternoon. But this was never his intention. He wanted only to halt the wholesale surveillance, which until he documented it, was being carried out without our consent or knowledge. The government officials, along with the courtiers in the press, castigate Snowden. They insist that congressional and judicial oversight, the right to privacy, the rule of law, the freedom of the press, the right to express dissent remains inviolate. They use the old words and old phrases, old laws and old constitutional guarantees to give our corporate totalitarianism a democratic veneer. They tell us the system works. They tell us we are still protected by the Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures, which shall not be violated, nor shall warrants be issued but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. Yet the promise of that sentence in the Bill of Rights is pitted against the fact that every telephone call we make, every email or text we send or receive, every website we visit, and our travels are tracked, recorded, and stored. in government computers. Now, Snowden, we are told, could have reformed from the inside. He could have gone to his superiors, or Congress, or the courts. But Snowden has numerous examples, including the persecution of Thomas Drake, who originally tried to go through proper channels, to remind him that working within the system is fatal. He had watched as senior officials, including Obama, lied to the public about internal surveillance. He knew that the president was dishonest when, for example, he assured Americans that the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court, which meets in secret and hears only from the government, is transparent. He knew that the president's statement that Congress was overseeing the entire program was false. He knew that everything the Director of National Intelligence, James Clapper, told the press, the Congress, and the public about the surveillance of Americans was untrue. And he knew that if this information were to be made available to the public, he would have to do it through a few independent journalists whose integrity he could trust. This deadly impasse, the tightening of the corporate totalitarian noose, would have continued if Snowden had not jolted the nation awake by disclosing the massive crimes of the prerogative state. Snowden's revelations triggered for the first time a genuine public debate about mass surveillance. Since the disclosures, we have had 3 judges, as I mentioned, rule. A presidential panel has established, and some members of Congress, although this was the body that authorized the Patriot Act and Section 10215, which ostensibly permitted wholesale surveillance, have expressed dismay at the extent of the NSA's activities and the weakness of its promised reforms. I do not trust the system to reform itself. But before Snowden, we had nothing. Snowden's revelations made us conscious. And as George Orwell wrote in 1984, until they become conscious, they will never rebel. Societies such as ours, that once had democratic traditions or periods when relative openness was possible, are often the most easily seduced into totalitarian systems, because those who rule and build totalitarian structures continue to pay outward fealty to the ideals, practices, and forms of the old system. This was true when Emperor Augustus dismantled the Roman Republic, was true when Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized control of the autonomous Soviets and ruthlessly centralized power. It was true following the collapse of the Weimar Republic and the rise of Nazi fascism. Thomas Paine described despotic governments as a fungus growing out of a corrupt civil society. And this is what has happened to us. No one who lives under constant surveillance, who is subject to tension anywhere at any time, whose conversations, messages, meetings, proclivities, and habits are recorded, stored, and analyzed is free. Yet the corporate state assures us that our rights are sacred, that it abides by the will of the people, that the Fourth Amendment remains intact, and that our system has the consent of the governed. The defense of liberty, which Snowden exhibited when he cast his fortune, his safety, and his life aside to inform the public of the forces arrayed against our constitutional rights, entails grave risks. It demands personal sacrifice. Snowden has called us to this sacrifice. He has allowed us to see who we are and what we have become. He has given us a chance. He has also shown us the heavy cost of defiance. It is up to us to seize this chance and dismantle the corporate state. This means removing from power those who have stolen our liberty and lied to us. It means refusing to naively trust in their cosmetic reforms. For reforms will never come for those who are complicit in crime. Reform will come and only come through the building of mass movements and alternative centers of power that can overthrow, let me repeat that word for Homeland Security, overthrow the corporate state. If we fail to sever these chains, we will become like many who did not rise up in time to save their civil society's human chattel. This means we too must defy the law and engage in civil disobedience. There is no other way for the truth to be told, and there is no other way for justice to be recovered. Do not be fooled by those in power. They will not save us. We can only save ourselves. We are the people we have been waiting for. We must find, like Snowden, the moral and physical courage to tear down the structures that enslave us. Appealing or trusting to these structures is a waste of time. And all those who insist that we be patient, that we trust the system to reform itself, offer an argument that is as cogent as the one made by the March Hare during the Mad Tea Party in Alice in Wonderland. Have some wine, the March Hare said in an encouraging tone. Alice looked all around the table, but there was nothing on it but tea. I don't see any wine, she remarked. There isn't any, said the March Hare. Thank you.